Jackie?
Fox News has learned President Putin now has 70% of the military forces he would need for a full invasion in place. This as the French president and German chancellor are heading to Moscow and Kiev in an effort to deter the Kremlin from invading Ukraine. Joining us now to discuss all of this, former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Ambassador William Taylor. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being with us. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jackie. Glad to be here.
So I want to start off. You recently told members of the Helsinki Commission that you think Putin will blink. What makes you think that? Everything that we're seeing shows that he's ramping up forces that he would need for this full invasion. There are estimates now that he could take Kiev in as little as 3 days. So what makes you think that he won't?
Jackie, I think President Putin hasn't decided yet. I think what he's told his military is do everything necessary, do everything that you have to do if I, President Putin, were to tell you to go across that border. And they're putting 70%, they'll probably have 100% of the troops necessary to do that. And the Russian military is doing exactly what President Putin said. That is, they're getting all ready. But he hasn't decided yet, I think. And that's the general understanding. He has not decided yet. And that means that he can still be deterred. And so that's what we need to do. And so what he will do, I believe, is he will not want to send his troops across that border. He would like for us to blink. He would like for President Zelensky in Ukraine to blink, or President Biden in Washington to blink, and give President Putin what he wants. And what he's after is Ukraine. And he would like to have Ukraine without that expense, without the cost that is clearly enormous of an invasion. And that cost comes in terms of the financial cost of sanctions, but also the real cost to his army. The Russian soldiers will die. Ukrainian soldiers will die. Ukrainian civilians will die. He will be an outcast. President Putin will be an outcast if he does that. That's a big cost. He would like not to have to pay that cost. He would like to get what he wants, which is Ukraine, without having to pay that. And he's waiting for President Zelensky and President Biden to blink. And so far, they have not blinked. He can be deterred. So
you mean when you say that he wants Ukraine without having to, basically shed any blood, are you suggesting that Ukraine publicly in this scenario gives up on NATO? Is that what you think he's seeking here?
I do, Jackie. I think he would like to see President Zelensky fold and say, okay, I won't try to join NATO, or okay, I won't try to join Europe. So far, President Zelensky has not said that. He does want to join NATO. He does want to join Europe. He wants to join the European Union. He has not blinked. And his supporters in Ukraine have all made it very clear that they are not eager. They're totally unwilling to go back under the Russian thumb. They want to be Europeans. Mm-hmm. They are Europeans. They want to be everything that Europe has.
So if Putin does not invade and Ukraine does not publicly say we've given up on NATO, in that case, what would Putin have gotten out of this? Just being able to test the cracks in NATO, or something more?
He will have tried to test the cracks. He will have tried and failed in this scenario to break up NATO or break up the strong support that the United States and NATO are giving to Ukraine. He will have failed at that. But he has also said that he's got some concerns, some security concerns. He's worried, for example, about our B-52 bombers that are coming a little too close to his borders. And he's worried that maybe someday we will put missiles in Ukraine that will threaten Moscow.
So he's seeking basically to move around arms.
He's worried that we're moving around arms. And we're concerned about his bombers and his military exercises and his missiles that challenge us. So there's a deal to be struck there, and that's one thing that he might be able to get out of this, an arms control treaty.
Real quick, because we are out of time, but I want to get just a very short answer from you. How concerned do we need to be about this partnership between Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping?
So they're going to be partners if they can, but there's a lot of problems in that relationship. We remember, Jackie, that in 2014, when the Russians first invaded Ukraine and we took it to the Security Council, UN Security Council, China abstained. We tried to condemn them. Of course, Russia vetoed it, but China abstained. So there's a lot of problems in that relationship.
Okay. All right. We are out of time. Ambassador William Taylor, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us.